The light was a liar. Before the sun crested the jagged teeth of the eastern mesas, the world was painted in shades of cool, deceptive blue. The air, still holding the ghost of night's chill, promised a relief that the coming day had no intention of delivering. It was in this brief, false peace that Boone Carter rode, the rhythm of his horse's gait a familiar metronome against the vast silence of the Arizona territory. The mare, Dusty, stepped carefully, her hooves making soft thuds in the fine, pale sand that choked the long, dead riverbed. This was his routine, a circuit he rode every few days to check the boundary fences and the water levels in the scattered, stubborn wells that kept his small ranch alive. It was a life measured in solitude and sweat, and he asked for little else. That's when Dusty stopped. Her head came up, ears swiveling, a low snort puffing from her nostrils. Boone's hand, resting easy on the worn leather of his saddle horn, tightened. He scanned the landscape. The skeletal arms of desiccated cottonwoods clawed at the graying sky. The cracked, mud-caked floor of the riverbed stretched out like the skin of an old drum. Nothing moved, nothing but the slow, inexorable creep of dawn. He nudged the horse forward, his eyes narrowed, tracing the ground, and then he saw it, a heap of shadow that didn't belong. Not a rock, not a fallen branch. It was a tangle of dark cloth and darker hair, slumped near the base of a high, eroded bank where the last trickle of water might have pooled weeks ago. He dismounted, the soft jingle of his spurs the only sound to break the stillness. He kept one hand near the colt at his hip, a habit as natural as breathing. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into two figures, two women, lying so still he thought them already gone. Apache. The beadwork on a torn sleeve and the style of their moccasins told him that much. They were young, though hardship had etched lines of age around their eyes and mouths. Dusty, sensing no immediate threat, took a step closer and lowered her head. Her hoof came down a foot from the older sister's head, dislodging a puff of alkali dust. The fine, white powder settled like a shroud over the dark, matted hair and clung to a patch of dried blood on her temple. The wound was ugly. A dark star burst against her copper skin. Even in what looked like the sleep of exhaustion or death, her body was a shield, curved around the smaller form of her sister. His gaze fell to her hand. It was clenched tight around a shard of metal, the broken tip of a knife blade. It was a pitiful weapon, no more than 3 inches long, but her grip was absolute. Her knuckles were white beneath the grime. As he watched, her fingers trembled, a violent, uncontrollable tremor born of fever or fear. But the hand did not open. The will was stronger than the body. It was the younger one who moved first. A faint, almost inaudible sigh escaped her cracked lips. Her head stirred in the sand, and her eyes, clouded with pain, fluttered open. They were dark, deep-set, and for a moment they held nothing but confusion. Then they found him. Fear, sharp and immediate, flashed through them. Her lips parted, and a sound emerged, a rasp of dry leaves skittering across stone. It was a single phrase, spoken in the Apache tongue. The words were alien to Boone's ears, but the tone was universal. It was not a plea. It was a warning, a final, desperate drawing of a line in the dirt. Stay back. The sound, as faint as it was, broke the spell of stillness. The older sister's eyes snapped open. There was no confusion in her gaze. There was only fire. A cold, hard, defiant fire that measured him, weighed him, and dismissed him as a threat to be eliminated. Her grip on the broken blade tightened, the metal digging into her palm. This was the moment of decision. The desert had its own brutal logic. You did not interfere. You did not take on another's trouble, for the land offered trouble enough of its own. He could mount his horse, ride away, and leave them to the judgment of the sun and the vultures. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. By noon, they would be a memory. By sunset, they would be part of the landscape. Boone did not move. He simply stood there, letting them see him. He was a tall man, built lean and hard by years of work. His face was weathered, browned by the sun, with lines around his eyes from squinting into the relentless glare. He was not a man given to easy smiles or soft words. He slowly, deliberately, raised his hands, showing them empty. The gesture was plain, "I mean no harm." He took a step forward. The older sister tensed. She tried to push herself up, a low growl forming in her throat. But the effort was too much. Her body betrayed her, and she fell back with a gasp, her head hitting the hard-packed sand. But her eyes never left him, burning with a furious, helpless light. Boone stopped. He unslung the canteen from his saddle. The slosh of the water inside was an obscene sound in the profound dryness. He uncorked it and took another slow step, then crouched, keeping a careful distance. He wasn't a fool. He knew that cornered things, whether animal or human, were the most dangerous. "Easy," he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse. He didn't know if they understood the word, but they would understand the tone. He held the canteen out, not toward the watchful, hostile sister, but toward the younger one. Her eyes were fixed on the dark, wet metal of the canteen. Her tongue darted out to lick her lips, a small, involuntary movement. She was dying of thirst, and her body knew it before her mind would allow it. The older sister saw the look. She spoke a sharp, guttural word in Apache. The younger sister's gaze flickered back to her, then to Boone, torn. "Water," Boone said, giving the canteen a small shake. He took another shuffling step forward on his knees, moving like a man approaching a spooked colt. He reached out, his movements measured and calm, and tilted the canteen toward the younger sister's mouth. For a heartbeat, he thought she would refuse. Then, instinct took over. Her mouth opened slightly, and he let a trickle of water fall onto her lips. It traced a clean line through the dust on her chin. She choked, then swallowed, a convulsive motion in her throat. He gave her another small sip, then another. The water was life, and it worked its magic quickly. A bit of clarity returned to her eyes. The terror receded, replaced by a dawning awareness. And that awareness was all it took to reignite the older sister. With a surge of strength he wouldn't have thought she possessed, she lunged. It wasn't a full-bodied attack. She was too weak for that. It was the desperate, flailing strike of a wounded animal, her hand with the broken blade slashing wildly at the air between them. Boone pulled back just in time, the shard of metal slicing nothing but morning light. She collapsed again, panting, the effort costing her nearly everything she had left. But she had made her point. Boone remained crouched, his heart hammering a little faster. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply looked at them, letting the silence stretch. He set the canteen on the ground between them, then slid it a few inches closer with the toe of his boot, an offering, a truce. For a long moment, nobody moved. The sun was higher now, its rays beginning to cut across the canyon floor, turning the blue shadows to a dusty gold. The heat was coming. Boone could feel it on the back of his neck. In an hour, this place would be an oven. The younger sister, revived by the water, pushed herself up on one elbow. She looked at the canteen, then at Boone, then at her sister. She murmured something soft in their language. The older sister didn't answer, her breath still coming in ragged bursts. But her eyes were locked on Boone's. It was in that shared gaze that something shifted. It was not trust. It was not gratitude. It was a raw, unspoken negotiation. Her eyes, filled with hate and suspicion, asked a question, why? Boone's eyes, steady and unreadable, gave the only answer he had, because I'm here. Because you're here. The younger sister reached out a trembling hand and drew the canteen closer. The older sister watched her drink, her jaw tight. But she did not stop her. When she was done, the younger one pushed the canteen toward her. The older sister stared at it for a long moment, her pride at war with her body's screaming need. Finally, her resolve broke. She took the canteen, drank greedily, and did not stop until it was half empty. She set it down, the sound of metal on baked earth unnaturally loud. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and met Boone's gaze again. The fire was still there, but it was banked now, simmering beneath a layer of weary calculation. A contract had been made. No words were spoken, no promises exchanged, but it was as binding as any document signed and sealed in a lawyer's office. He had offered them life, and they had, however reluctantly, accepted it. He was now responsible for them. They were now his problem. Boone rose slowly to his feet. He looked from the two women, huddled in the dirt, to the vast, indifferent expanse of the territory around them. He could already feel the complications settling onto his shoulders, a weight heavier than any saddle. Saving them was one thing. Bringing two Apache women back to his ranch was another entirely. It was an invitation for suspicion, for judgment, for the kind of trouble that arrived on horseback with rifles in hand. He had lived his life by a simple code: mind your own business and expect others to do the same. He had just broken his own rule. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut that by choosing not to ride away, he had opened a door, and he had no idea what was about to walk through it. The work began in the stark, unforgiving light of the risen sun. Boone retrieved a small leather pouch from his saddlebags, its contents simple and practical: a curved needle, a spool of waxed linen thread, a small flask of whiskey, and a strip of clean, worn cotton cloth. He knelt again, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived without wasted effort. He looked at the older sister, whose eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, missed nothing. "This will sting," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The cut needs cleaning." He didn't wait for a reply she couldn't give. He uncorked the flask, the sharp scent of alcohol cutting through the dusty air. He poured a small amount onto a piece of the cloth, his movements steady. As he reached for her temple, she flinched, a bare tightening of her jaw the only outward sign of her resistance. Her hand, the one not clutching the broken blade, clenched into a fist in the sand. "I have to," he said, his voice holding no apology, only fact. He gently but firmly cupped her chin, holding her head still. He pressed the whiskey-soaked cloth to the wound. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath through her teeth, and her whole body went rigid. A single tear of pain squeezed from the corner of her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek, but she made no other sound. He cleaned the wound with swift, efficient dabs, wiping away the dried blood and sand. The gash was ugly but clean, a straight line as if from a glancing blow. "It needs a few stitches," he stated, already threading the needle. "It will heal better." He looked from the needle in his hand to her eyes. He was explaining himself, not asking for permission. It was a strange courtesy, an acknowledgement of her fierce, silent will. He expected her to fight, to pull away, but she just watched him, her gaze a burning point of focus. It was as if she were committing every detail of his face to memory, cataloging him for some future reckoning. His fingers, thick and calloused from rope and leather and wood, were surprisingly deft. He made 3 quick, precise stitches, pulling the skin together with a craftsman's care. He knotted the thread, snipped it with a small knife from his belt, and then covered his work with a folded piece of the clean cloth, securing it by tying a strip of the same fabric around her head. Throughout the entire process, she did not move, did not blink. She simply endured, a statue of defiance carved from flesh and bone. When he was done, he turned his attention to the younger sister. She had watched the entire procedure with wide, frightened eyes. She seemed to have no major injuries, only a collection of scrapes and deep bruises, and a terrifying weakness that left her trembling. He checked her for broken bones, his hands moving over her limbs with a detached professionalism. As he gently probed a dark bruise on her forearm, she spoke. Her voice was thin, fragile as a bird's wing. "Ayana," she said. Boone paused, looking at her face. "Is that your name?" She nodded, a small, jerky motion. She gestured with her chin toward her sister, who was now sitting up, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if he were no longer there. "Ka!" Ayanna whispered. Boone looked at the older sister. "Ka," he said, testing the name. It was short and hard, like a stone. Ka gave a single, sharp nod, a bare acknowledgement that he had heard correctly. That was all. No thanks, no greeting. The name was given, and the transaction was complete. Getting them onto the horse was a delicate operation. Ayanna was too weak to sit on her own, and Ka, despite her iron will, was unsteady on her feet. Boone knew Dusty could carry the weight, but the arrangement would be a trial for all of them. He mounted first, then reached down, circling Ayanna's waist with one arm and lifting her with a grunt. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of sharp angles and surprising fragility. He settled her in front of him, her back resting against his chest. He could feel the rapid, shallow beat of her heart against his ribs, the faint warmth of her breath on his neck. She slumped against him, her body surrendering to an exhaustion too deep to fight. Ka was a different matter. She swung herself up behind him with a lithe movement that belied her injuries. She settled onto the horse's rump, her posture stiff and alert. Boone was immediately, intensely aware of her presence. She didn't lean against him. She maintained a deliberate, taut space between their bodies, and he felt more than saw. The moment she shifted the broken knife from her right hand to her left, the one closest to his ribs. It wasn't a threat, not an overt one. It was a statement of fact, a reminder of the fragile, conditional nature of their truce. He was their savior, but he was also their captor, and the line between the two was as thin as a razor's edge. The journey back to his ranch was a slow, silent procession under a sun that had begun its daily assault. The heat rose in shimmering waves from the parched earth. The world seemed to shrink to the immediate, physical sensations of the ride, the rhythmic sway of the horse, the creak of saddle leather, the heavy, shared breathing. The air grew thick with the smells of their ordeal, the dust of the trail, the rich animal scent of the horse, the sharp tang of their own sweat, and the faint, coppery smell of blood, all mingling with the dry, herbal perfume of sage and sun-baked creosote. Boone could feel the heat of Ayanna's fever through his shirt, a damp, clinging warmth behind him. Ka was a rigid presence, a silent sentinel whose tension radiated into his own back muscles. They rode for what felt like an eternity, 3 solitary figures moving through a vast, indifferent landscape. Boone's ranch appeared first as a dark smudge against the pale brown hills, slowly resolving into the familiar shapes of his life, a small, sturdy cabin of cottonwood logs, a barn, a corral, and a windmill that turned with a weary groan in the hot breeze. It was a lonely place, but it was his, a place of order and solitude. As he reined Dusty to a halt in the yard, Ka slid from the horse's back before he could offer a hand. She stumbled, but caught herself, her hand flat against the horse's flank. Her first act was not to seek shade or water, but to move. She walked. With a slight limp she tried to hide, directly to the cabin's porch and stood before the single wooden door. Turning to face him, her body was a barricade. She stood, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, blocking the entrance to his own home. Boone understood the gesture perfectly. She was claiming sanctuary, drawing a line he was not to cross. He dismounted carefully, then reached up to help Ayanna. She was barely conscious, her weight a dead thing in his arms. He lifted her down and she sagged against him, her legs unable to support her. He half carried her to the porch and gently set her down on the rough wooden planks, her back resting against the cabin wall. He looked at Ka, whose eyes dared him to challenge her. He did not. He turned away without a word, unsaddled Dusty, and led her to the trough, pumping fresh, cool water for her. He went into the storeroom next to the barn and returned with a strip of dried beef and a dipper full of water. He walked to the porch, placed the offerings on the top step, well away from their feet, and then backed away. "The cabin is yours," he said, his voice flat. "I'll be in the barn." Ka just stared at him, her silence more potent than any words. He gave a final nod, turned his back on them and his home, and walked toward the barn, the jingle of his spurs the only sound in the oppressive heat of the afternoon. The first night was long. Boone lay on a pile of hay in the barn loft, his saddle for a pillow, the familiar smells of hay and leather and horse flesh doing little to soothe him. The door to the barn was open, and he could see the dark shape of the cabin silhouetted against a sky littered with a million cold, distant stars. His home, and yet it felt miles away. He couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the events of the day, the weight of his decision settling in. He listened to the sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the mournful call of a distant coyote, the soft rustle of the horses in their stalls below, and then a new sound. It was a low murmur, rising and falling, coming from the cabin. It was the sound of their voices, speaking in the soft, guttural tones of the Apache language. He couldn't understand a word, but he could hear the cadence of a story, of questions, of fear and pain being shared in the dark. The sound was a wall between him and them, a reminder that he was an outsider to the world he had just saved. He lay there for hours, listening to the alien whispers float across the yard, wondering what they were saying about their flight, their wounds, and the strange, quiet man who had brought them here. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and gray, the cabin was silent. He rose, his body stiff, and went about his morning chores. He milked his one cow, fed the chickens, checked on the horses. As he walked back from the well, a bucket of fresh water in each hand, he saw that the dipper and the plate that had held the jerky were sitting on the edge of the porch. The food was gone. He picked them up. The plate was not just empty, it had been scraped clean. The wooden bowl was cleaner than it had been when he left it. Later that morning, as he was mending a split rail on the corral fence, he glanced toward the cabin. The door was ajar, and for a moment, he could see inside. He saw Ayana lying on his cot, and Ka was beside her, carefully, methodically rewrapping the bandage on Ayana's bruised forearm. The crude bandage he had tied around Ka's own head was gone, replaced by a neater, more securely tied strip of cloth. They were not helpless. They were survivors. He finished his work and turned back toward the barn. He stopped at the cabin's porch and left a small portion of cheese and 2 apples on the step. He did not knock. He did not call out. He did not attempt to cross the invisible line Ka had drawn. An unspoken rule had been established in the silent language of their new reality he would provide. He would protect the space around them, but he would not enter their world unless he was invited. A week passed in a language of silence. The days fell into a hard, spare rhythm, dictated by the sun and the unspoken rules of their strange cohabitation. Each morning, Boone would leave a bucket of fresh water, milk, and whatever food he had: cornbread, a portion of beans, sometimes a few eggs on the top step of the porch. Each evening, he would return to find the bucket and plates waiting for him, empty and clean. He slept in the barn, the scent of hay a familiar comfort, and worked his land from dawn until dusk, always conscious of the 2 sets of eyes that might be watching him from the dark rectangle of the cabin doorway. The silence was not empty. It was filled with observation. He learned to read the state of their small, besieged world by the objects left on the porch: a piece of cloth, torn into a new bandage, a bowl scraped so clean it shone, a small bundle of bitter herbs he didn't recognize, left to dry in the sun. They were not just taking, they were living, healing, making this small, borrowed space their own. By the 4th day, a visible change had occurred. Ayana's fever broke. He knew it not by any word, but because when he glanced at the cabin in the afternoon, he saw her sitting up on his cot, her silhouette framed by the open door. The slumped, boneless shape of illness was gone, replaced by a fragile but upright posture, a quiet victory, felt across the dusty yard. With Ayana's improvement, Ka began to move, in the cool, gray light of early morning. As Boone headed for the corral, he saw her emerge from the cabin. She moved with a fluid grace, her moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. But he saw a slight stiffness in her right leg, a hesitation so brief it was almost imperceptible. She favored it, hiding the movement in the flow of her stride. But it was there, another wound, one he hadn't seen, one she had chosen not to show. It was a piece of her story she kept to herself, a testament to a pride as fierce and unyielding as the desert itself. She did not approach him. She began a slow, deliberate circuit of the homestead, a perimeter check. She walked to the windmill, placing a hand on the cool metal of its leg, her head tilted back as if listening to the groaning turn of the blades. She paced the length of the corral, her eyes on Dusty and his pack mule. She was assessing their health, their strength. She was gauging his resources. He continued with his work, forking hay into the trough, his movements measured, pretending not to watch her, but every nerve was aware of her position, her silent evaluation. She never came closer than 10 yards. The invisible line held. She was a hawk circling a potential nesting ground, wary, missing nothing. Her inspection ended at the barn. She stood at the wide, open entrance, peering into the shadows where he slept, her gaze lingering on his saddle, his tools hanging in neat order on the wall. She was reading the story of his life, and he felt a strange vulnerability, as if his most private thoughts were laid bare. Then, as silently as she had appeared, she retreated to the cabin. The first crack in the silence came 2 days later. Boone was replacing a rotten post in the corral fence, the repetitive work a balm to his overfull mind. The thud of the maul against the new post was a steady, grounding beat. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of a leather glove, and his eyes found the cabin door. Ayana was standing there, leaning against the frame. The harsh sunlight was softened by the shadow of the porch roof, and it caught in her dark hair. She was thin, her dress hanging loosely on her frame, but she was standing on her own. He expected her to shrink back when their eyes met, but she held his gaze. And then, she smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a small, hesitant curve of her lips, a flicker of light in the deep shadows of her eyes. It was a fragile thing, but it hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was the first sign of warmth, of peace. He had seen in either of them. It was a beginning. He gave a short, stiff nod in return, then turned back to his work, the rhythm of his hammering suddenly feeling clumsy and loud. That evening, when he brought the food, Ayana was sitting on the top step, waiting. Ka was visible just inside the doorway, a silent, watchful shadow. Ayana looked down at the offering of stewed rabbit and corn cakes he placed before her. "Thank you," she said. The English words were soft, the edges roughened by her native tongue. Boone stopped. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since the riverbed. Her face, now clean and free from the mask of pain and fever, was younger than he had thought. Her eyes were large and dark, and they held a deep, quiet intelligence. "Couldn't ride past and leave you," he said. The words were inadequate, but they were the truest he had. It wasn't charity. It was an imperative, a law of the land more fundamental than any written by men. You don't leave a life to burn out in the sun if you have water to give. Ayana considered his answer. She looked over her shoulder at Ka, who had not moved. Ka's gaze was not on Ayana, or on his face. It was fixed on his hands. He looked down at them. They were calloused and stained with dirt and pine tar from the fence post, but they were steady. He realized she had been watching his hands all week, watching how he handled his tools, how he soothed his horse, how he placed the food on the step. She was not listening to his words. She was reading his actions, judging him by the work his hands performed. by their capacity for creation or destruction. Ayana turned back to him. Her small smile returned, this time with a hint of sadness. "My sister," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "She says you are dangerous." The word landed like a stone in the quiet air. Dangerous. Boone felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He had expected suspicion, fear, even hatred. But this was different. It felt like a judgment. He had done nothing to threaten them. He had given them his home, his food, his protection. He waited for her to continue, his body tilled, ready for an accusation. Ayana looked down at her own hands, twisting in her lap. "She says you are dangerous," she repeated softly, "because you make us want to stay." The world shifted on its axis. The heat, the dust, the vast, empty sky had all receded, and all that was left was the space between him and this young woman and the stunning, terrifying weight of her words. The danger was not in his fists or his gun. The danger was in the food he provided, the roof he offered, the quiet respect he showed for their boundaries. The danger was the fragile seed of hope he had planted without even realizing it. Hope was a perilous thing in a land that offered so little of it. To want to stay was to risk a pain far deeper than any physical wound, the pain of it being taken away. He had no answer for that. He could only stand there, caught in the undertow of an emotion he couldn't name. He gave another short nod, a gesture that felt utterly meaningless, and retreated to the barn. That night, sleep would not come. He lay on the hay, staring up at the dark rafters, Ayana's words echoing in the silence. Dangerous. He finally understood. He had thought his duty ended with their survival, that once they were strong enough, they would leave, disappearing back into the desert from which they came. He would go back to his solitary life, and they would become a story he might one day tell himself. But her words had changed everything. They had drawn a line connecting his future to theirs. Helping them survive had been simple, but making them want to stay, that was a complication that had no easy solution. It meant they were no longer just Apache women he had found by a river. They were Ka and Ayana. They had a presence, a history, a claim on this place that grew stronger with every clean plate, every sunrise they watched from the cabin door. The clear, simple line between benefactor and stranger had dissolved. He was no longer just the man who had saved them. He was becoming the reason they might risk everything to build a new life. And as the moon cast long shadows through the barn door, Boone Carter understood, with a profound and unsettling certainty, that their presence on his land was no longer a temporary arrangement. It was a question, and sooner or later it would demand an answer that he would be forced to choose. The invisible wall dissolved not with a crash, but with the soft scrape of a shovel on hard-packed earth. It happened on a morning so still you could hear the buzz of a fly across the yard. Boone was mucking out the mule's stall, the familiar rhythm of the work a mindless comfort. He pitched a forkful of soiled hay into the wheelbarrow, and when he turned back, Ka was there. She had not made a sound. She stood just inside the wide barn door, the morning sun at her back turning her into a dark, sharp-edged silhouette. In her hands, she held a short-handled spade he usually kept by the cabin for digging out stubborn roots. She had not asked. She had not waited for an invitation. She had simply crossed the threshold, breaking the unspoken rule that had governed their lives for more than a week. Boone straightened, his hand tight on the pitchfork. He said nothing. He watched as she walked past him, her limp barely noticeable now, and entered the empty stall next to the mules. She dropped the spade, its iron head clanging against the floor, and began scraping the packed, dried manure with a focused, efficient energy. She worked with her back to him, a clear and simple statement. This is happening. I am here now. We will work. And so they worked. The silence in the barn was different now. It was no longer the silence of separation, but the close, intimate silence of shared labor. The only sounds were the scrape of their tools, the rustle of hay, the soft snorts and stomps of the animals, They moved around each other in the confined space, a clumsy dance at first, then settling into a natural rhythm. He would move the wheelbarrow, and she would be there with the broom to sweep the spot where it had been. He would reach for the sack of fresh bedding, and her hand would already be there, helping him lift it. He discovered she knew horses. His young gelding, a half-broke Mustang he called Flicker for its nervous, skittish energy, was a daily trial. The horse hated the feel of a saddle blanket, bunching its muscles and sidestepping, its eyes rolling white with fear. This morning was no different. Boone approached with the blanket held out, speaking in a low, soothing voice, but Flicker was already dancing, blowing hard through its nostrils, ready to bolt. Ka stopped her work. She leaned on her spade, watching him. Her face was impassive, but her eyes were sharp, analytical. After he failed for the third time, the horse nearly kicking the blanket from his hand, she walked over. She did not speak to him. She spoke to the horse. She made a low, humming sound in her throat, a sound like wind through dry grass. She moved slowly, not directly at the horse's head, but in a circling path that respected its space. She laid her spade down without a sound. She held her empty hands out, palms up. Flicker's ears swiveled toward her, its panicked snorting quieting slightly. She stopped a few feet from its head and simply breathed, a long, slow inhale, a longer, slower exhale. Boone stood frozen, holding the blanket, watching. He could feel the tension draining out of the air, replaced by the steady, calm rhythm of her breath. She took a step closer, still breathing, and the horse stood its ground, its quivering flank beginning to still. She reached out, not for its face, but for its powerful neck, and laid her palm flat against the tense muscle. She did not stroke or pat it. She just held her hand there, a point of steady, warm contact, breathing her own calm into the animal's fear. After a long minute, she turned her head slightly toward Boone and gave a single, sharp nod. He stepped forward, moving with the same deliberate slowness she had used. He lifted the blanket, and this time, when he laid it across Flicker's back, the horse only flinched, a minor tremor, before standing still under Ka's unwavering hand. She had tamed the storm in the horse not with force, but with a stillness more powerful than any rope or command. While Ka brought her silent competence to the barn, Ayanna brought a different kind of life to the homestead. She found the small, sun-scorched vegetable patch behind the cabin, a place Boone had long since given up on. He watched from a distance as she worked there in the afternoons, kneeling in the dirt, her slender fingers gently pulling weeds, turning over the dry, cracked soil. She carried water in the dipper, trip after trip, patiently coaxing the wilted squash and bean plants back from the edge of death. She began to venture further, returning with her skirt gathered up, holding a bounty of wild things he had never known were edible. The tender green leaves of amaranth, the sour tang of purslane, the small, starchy roots of a wild onion. That evening, for the first time, they did not eat separately. Ayanna brought 3 wooden bowls out to the porch steps as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon. She had made a stew, thick with beans and squash from her resurrected garden, flavored with the wild greens and a few pieces of dried beef. The smell was rich and earthy, a smell of home that struck Boone with a surprising force. He sat on a lower step, Ka on the opposite end, and Ayanna between them but a step above. They ate without speaking. The only sounds the clink of their spoons against the bowls. The food was simple, but it was the best thing he had tasted in years. It tasted of care. It was in these shared spaces, the barn, the porch, that the air began to grow heavy. The silence, once a truce, was now a vessel for things left unsaid. Boone felt it in the small, fleeting moments of contact. Once, while he and Ka were securing a loose board in a stall, they both reached for the hammer at the same time. His calloused fingers brushed against hers. It was nothing, a flicker of contact. Over in a second. But when he glanced up, he saw Ayanna standing in the barn doorway, a basket of greens in her hand, her eyes fixed on their hands. The small, hopeful smile she so often wore was gone, replaced by a shadow that made her seem fragile. Lost. She turned and walked away before either of them could speak. Another day, after the evening meal, Ayanna was telling him about a particular plant she had found, her English still hesitant but growing more confident. She laughed at his clumsy attempt to pronounce its Apache name, a light, musical sound that felt foreign and welcome in the dusty yard. As she laughed, she reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, a gesture of easy, unthinking warmth. Across the porch, Boone saw Ka's back stiffen. Her spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. Her jaw tightened, a subtle shift of muscle, but it was as expressive as a shout. She set her bowl down with a sharp click, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet evening, and rose to take it inside, her grace replaced by a rigid control. No one argued, no harsh words were spoken, but the peace was gone. The air grew thick and watchful. Boone found himself caught in the cross-current of two powerful, silent tides. When he worked alongside Ka in the barn, he felt a profound sense of partnership. They were a team. She understood the hard logic of survival. Her strength was a palpable thing, a shield against the harshness of their world. She was a comrade, an equal in the daily battle against the land. With her, he felt capable, grounded. But when he sat on the porch and listened to Ayanna's soft voice, or watched her hands gently tending her plants, he felt a different kind of pull. It was a pull toward a quiet he had forgotten existed. It was the promise of a peace that went beyond mere survival, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Ayanna was a harbor, a place of rest for a soul he hadn't realized was so weary. She was the calm at the center of the storm. He felt himself torn, pulled between the woman who could help him fight the storm and the woman who made him believe the storm might one day end. The homestead, once his solitary kingdom, had become a territory defined by two opposing forces, the fierce, practical competence of Ka and the gentle, life-giving tranquility of Ayanna, the comrade and the comfort. And he was standing in the middle, the ground shifting beneath his feet with every shared meal, every accidental touch, every unspoken, jealous glance. The fragile bubble of their self-contained world was stretched thin, shimmering with a tension that he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, could not hold for much longer. Something, or someone, was coming to break it. The rider was a plume of dust on the horizon long before he was a man. Boone saw him from the edge of the corral, a dark, approaching speck in the vast, shimmering heat of midday. In the weeks the sisters had been there, no one had come. The ranch's isolation had been a blessing, a protective bubble that allowed their fragile world to form. Now, the bubble was about to burst. He watched the rider resolve into a familiar shape, Fletcher Knox, his nearest neighbor, whose land was a good 5 miles east. Fletcher was a hard, practical man, his face a roadmap of sun and suspicion. He was not a man who rode 5 miles for a social call. As the horse trotted into the yard, Boone saw Ayanna, who had been tending her garden, freeze like a startled doe. She slowly straightened, wiping her dirt-stained hands on her skirt, her body tensing. From the barn, where she had been mending a bridle, Ka emerged into the light. She did not freeze. She became unnaturally still. Her eyes narrowed, her hand resting on her hip as if reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. Boone walked to the center of the yard, his posture deliberately neutral, and waited. Fletcher reined in his sweat-streaked bay, not dismounting. He was a man who preferred to talk down to others, literally and figuratively. His gaze flicked from Boone to Ayanna, then to Ka, a quick, dismissive appraisal that took in their Apache dresses, their dark hair, their very existence as an unwelcome anomaly. He grunted, a sound that was more judgment than greeting. "Boone," he said, his voice dry as the dust his horse had kicked up. "Fletcher," Boone replied, his own voice level. Fletcher's eyes lingered on Ka for a moment longer before settling back on Boone. "People are talking." The words were flat, devoid of emotion, and more menacing than any shout. They hung in the hot, still air, an indictment. Talk was a current in this empty land. Once it started flowing, it could wash away a man's reputation, his safety, his life. Boone didn't rise to the bait. He waited. "The Miller place was hit 2 nights ago," Fletcher said, shifting his weight in the saddle. "Over by the Verde, pair of riders. Took 3 of their best horses and all the smoked meat they had stored. Scared Martha Miller half to death." Boone's face remained a mask. The Miller place was 30 miles away. It had nothing to do with him. "Nobody saw who did it," Fletcher continued, his eyes cold and direct. "Just shadows in the dark. But folks get nervous when things like that happen. They start looking around, asking questions, wondering what's different." His gaze slid meaningfully toward the 2 women, who stood like statues under the relentless sun. The insinuation was as clear and as ugly as a rattler coiled in the path. It didn't matter if it was true. It only mattered that it was possible, that a seed of fear had been planted. "I've known you a long time." "Boone," Fletcher said, his voice lowering slightly. A man offering what he considered a kindness. "You're a quiet man. Keep to yourself. Folks respect that. But this," he gestured with his chin toward the cabin, "this is not keeping to yourself. This is inviting trouble not just into your own house, but to the whole area." "They were hurt," Boone said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Dying. I gave them water." "Water is one thing," Fletcher shot back, his voice hardening. "A roof and a bed is another. People see you harboring them, and they see the Millers losing their stock, and they're gonna draw a line between the 2. Doesn't need to be a straight line. Fear draws any line it wants." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his saddle horn, his voice dropping to a low, final warning. "I'm here as a neighbor, Boone, not as a threat, but a threat is coming. You need to handle this. You keep them here. You're making a statement. And when the real trouble comes looking, folks might not be so quick to ride to your aid. They might just figure you brought it on yourself. You'll be on your own." He straightened up, gathering his reins. He had delivered his message. He gave one last, hard look at Ka, whose stare had not wavered, had not shown a flicker of fear or anger. She simply absorbed his presence, his words, as another feature of a hostile landscape. Then he turned his horse, and without another word, rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. For a long time, nobody moved. The 3 of them were frozen in a tableau of crisis. The sounds of the homestead, which had become a comfort, the creak of the windmill, the soft clucking of the chickens now seemed brittle, fragile. The world Fletcher had brought with him was loud and ugly, and it had drowned out their quiet peace. Finally, Ayanna broke the spell. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since Fletcher arrived, and with her head bowed, she walked quickly, almost running, back into the shelter of the cabin. Ka remained where she was for another minute, her eyes on the dust cloud that was Fletcher Knox, before she too turned and disappeared into the shadows of the barn. Boone was left alone in the center of the yard, the sun beating down on his head. Fletcher's words echoed in the silence. Fear draws any line it wants. The rest of the afternoon passed in a tense, unnatural quiet. The rhythm of work was broken. Boone tried to fix a loose hinge on the tack room door, but his hands felt clumsy, his mind elsewhere. From the cabin, there was no sound. From the barn, only a profound stillness. The shared spaces had become separate territories again, each of them retreating into their own solitude to wrestle with the poison Fletcher had left behind. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised colors, Ka came to him. He was sitting on the edge of the porch, staring at nothing, a cold cup of coffee in his hands. She didn't approach from the side, but walked directly in front of him and stopped, forcing him to look up. Her face was calm, her expression set, as if she had spent the afternoon weighing every option and had come to the only logical conclusion. "We should go," she said. Her voice was flat, a statement of irrefutable fact. There was no self-pity in it, no fear. It was the decision of a strategist cutting her losses. Boone looked up at her. He saw the strength in her, the unbending will that had kept her and her sister alive. She was willing to walk back into the desert that had nearly killed them to protect him from the trouble she believed they had caused. It was a sacrifice offered with the same practicality she used to mend a bridle or clean a stall. He set his cup down on the wooden planks. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice low. The question caught her off guard. Her entire being was focused on the tactical necessity of leaving. The concept of want was a luxury she had never been able afford. Her jaw tightened, and her throat worked as if she were trying to swallow words that were fighting their way up. Her eyes, for the first time, held a flicker of something other than fierce control. It was a deep, aching conflict. He could see the answer she would not speak. No. She did not want to leave this place of tentative safety, this place of shared work and quiet meals. But wanting had nothing to do with it. Survival did. Before she could form a reply, a different voice, soft as mist, spoke from the cabin doorway. "We are protecting ourselves from what we want." Ayanna stood there, a silhouette against the dim light of the cabin's interior. She had been listening. She stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet silent on the wood. Her gaze was not on Ka, but on Boone. Her words hung in the cooling air. A perfect, painful truth that laid all three of them bare. They had been protecting themselves from the very thing they had started to build. He had protected himself from connection with his solitude. Ka had protected herself from hope with her hard-edged pragmatism. Ayanna had protected herself from the pain of loss by never allowing herself to truly take root. Fletcher Knox hadn't brought the trouble. He had only given it a name and a face. The real conflict was already there, a silent battle being waged within their own hearts. Night fell, not as a gentle blanket, but as a heavy, smothering weight. Boone retreated to the barn, but found no rest. He lay on his bed of hay, listening. The wind had picked up, a restless sighing sound that rattled the loose boards of the roof. It sounded like the world whispering Fletcher's warning over and over again. He could not hear the sisters' voices from the cabin tonight. The silence was absolute, a void filled with the turmoil he knew they must be feeling. He was no longer just a man on a piece of land. He was a choice. His homestead was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crossroads. The fragile, unspoken bond that had grown between the three of them, the comfortable rhythm of shared work, the quiet understanding in a shared glance. The complicated pull of two different kinds of hope had been stretched taut. It was a thin, vibrating wire in the dark, humming with the pressure of want and fear and the coming dawn. And Boone knew, with a certainty that felt like a cold stone in his stomach, that a single touch, a single word, would be enough to make it snap. The morning did not bring peace. The dawn broke on a world that had been stripped bare of pretense. The silence of the previous weeks was gone, replaced by a charged, humming tension that felt like the air before a lightning strike. Boone felt it from the moment he left the barn. There was no food left on the porch to collect, no sign of movement from the cabin. It was as if the homestead itself was holding its breath. The explosion came just after the sun had cleared the mesas. It started not with a shout, but with the cabin door being thrown open with such force that it slammed against the exterior wall. Ayanna strode out into the dusty yard, her face a mask of anguish. Ka followed a step behind, her movements tight and controlled, her expression a thundercloud. They met in the center of the yard, the same spot where Fletcher Knox had delivered his verdict, and they began to argue. It was in Apache, a language Boone could not understand, but the meaning was brutally clear. This was not the quiet, murmured conversation he had heard through the cabin walls. This was a battle. Ka's voice was low and guttural. each word a sharp, percussive blow. She stood rooted to the spot, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Ayanna was a storm of motion, pacing back and forth, her hands flying as she spoke, her voice rising and falling in a cadence of desperate pleading and raw frustration. Boone stood by the corral, a forgotten bucket in his hand, unable to move, unable to look away. He was witnessing the eruption of a pain that had been simmering for weeks, for years, perhaps for their entire lives. He caught fragments of emotion in their tones, Ayanna's voice breaking on a word that sounded like a name, Kaa's voice cutting back with a sound as sharp and final as a slammed door. This was about more than just him, more than just this ranch. This was about a lifetime of choices and sacrifices, of two sisters bound together by blood and tragedy, now being torn apart by the impossible hope this place represented. The argument escalated. Ayanna stopped pacing and faced her sister, her hands outstretched in a gesture of appeal. She spoke a long, flowing sentence, her voice soft and trembling. Kaa's response was a single, violent shake of her head. She shot back a volley of words, short and sharp as thrown stones. Then Ayanna did something that seemed to break the last thread of Kaa's control. She reached out and laid a hand on her sister's arm. In response, Kaa's hand shot out and clamped down on Ayanna's wrist, her fingers digging in. Ayanna cried out, a short, sharp sound of pain, and tried to pull away. Kaa's grip only tightened. Boone moved. He didn't think, he reacted. He dropped the bucket, crossed the yard in 3 long strides, and put his hand on Kaa's arm. "Let her go," he said, his voice a low command. It was like throwing a bucket of water on a grease fire. The fire didn't go out, it exploded. In perfect, terrifying unison, both sisters turned on him. The argument between them was forgotten, replaced by a new, singular focus. Their combined anguish and frustration, which had been directed at each other, now had a new target. Him. "You!" Kaa hissed, releasing Ayanna's wrist and shoving her away. She took a step toward Boone, her eyes blazing with a cold, furious fire. Ayanna, rubbing her wrist, moved to stand beside her, no longer an opponent but an ally in this new confrontation. They faced him, a united front of accusation. "You do this," Kaa said, her English clipped and sharp. "You stand in the middle. You say nothing. You let this grow like a weed until it chokes us both. Now you will choose." Boone was stunned into silence. He had tried to be an anchor, a point of stability. He saw now that he had been the fulcrum, the pivot point on which their lives were tearing themselves apart. It was Kaa who laid out the first terms, her words as hard and practical as the land around them. "You want a wife," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, a challenge. "You want a woman for this house. What is a wife, I will tell you. A wife is not a garden. A wife is a second rifle on the wall. She is the one who can pull a bullet from your shoulder when you cannot reach. She can ride all day and not complain. And she can fight with you, back to back, when Fletcher Knox and his friends come to burn you out." She took another step closer, her gaze unwavering. She was not speaking of love or affection. She was speaking the language he understood best, the brutal calculus of survival. "This is the fairness of action. I bring strength. I can help you hold this land. I can stand beside you when the storm comes. That is my worth." She fell silent, her case made. The air vibrated with the force of her words. She was offering him a partnership, a fortress for two against a hostile world. Then Ayanna spoke. Her voice was not a counter-argument. It was a different truth altogether, soft but with a core of unshakable steel. "A body can survive," she said, her eyes fixed on his, filled with a profound, aching sadness. "We survived in the desert. We survived before we met you. Surviving is not the same as living." She looked around the homestead, at her small, thriving garden, at the cabin that had been her sanctuary. "This place, you did not just give us water for our bodies. You gave my heart a place to be still. You made me want to wake in the morning to see the sun, not just to endure it. A man needs a rifle, yes, but he also needs a reason to lift it, a reason to fight for the quiet at the end of the day. She looked directly at him, her vulnerability a weapon more potent than Ka's strength. This is the fairness of the heart. I cannot help you fight the storm, but I can give you the peace that comes after it has passed. I can make this a home, not just a shelter. That is my worth. They stood there, the three of them, locked in a triangle of impossible choices, the comrade and the comfort, the shield and the harbor, the two halves of a life he never knew he wanted, now laid before him as a choice that would break one. You cannot have both, Ka said, her voice final. You cannot have a partner in the barn and a home in the cabin. The silence is over. The time for hiding is over. You must choose. Choose, Ayanna echoed. The single word, a whisper that carried all the weight of their futures. He felt trapped, cornered. There was nowhere to run from the intensity of their gazes, from the stark, unassailable truth of their demands. He looked from Ka's fierce, proud face to Ayanna's soft, pleading eyes. To choose one was to sentence the other to exile. To choose one was to destroy the other. Fletcher Knox will be back, Ka stated, her eyes narrowing. He will not be alone next time. You have 3 days. Before the sun sets on the 3rd day from now, you will give us your choice. Then she did something that cemented the terrible solemnity of the moment. She reached out and took Ayanna's hand, not in anger, but in a gesture of solidarity, of a shared, bitter honor. The one who is not chosen, Ka said, her voice clear and steady, her eyes locked on Boone's, will leave. At sunrise on the 4th day, there will be no tears. There will be no begging. She will take a horse and enough food and water for 3 days. She will leave with her dignity. This is our promise. Ayanna nodded, her eyes glistening but her chin held high. A promise, she confirmed. Boone looked at their joined hands, at the pact they had just sealed in his name. He had saved their lives by the river. And now, in his own yard, he was being asked to shatter one of them. He understood the brutal mercy of their ultimatum. They were giving him the power to choose, but they were also giving him the full weight of the consequence. The promise was not for him. It was for them. It was their way of ensuring that whatever pain he caused, they would not inflict more upon each other. He was alone, more alone than he had ever been in his life. The choice they had given him was not about which woman he wanted. It was about what kind of life he was willing to build and what price he was willing to pay for it. He knew then that their promise didn't erase the pain. It only taught you how to carry it. And for the next 3 days, he would have to learn its weight. The first day of the ultimatum dawned cold and gray. Boone rose from his bed of hay before the sun, his body heavy with a lack of sleep, his mind a tangled knot. The choice sat like a stone in his stomach. He moved through the familiar motions of his morning chores, but there was no comfort in them, only a hollow echo. The world had been reduced to a timeline of 3 days. As he approached the corral, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the barn. It was Ka. She had risen before him, and she was waiting. She held a long, coiled rope in her hands, its loops neat and purposeful. She didn't greet him. She simply looked toward the far end of the corral where the young gelding, Flicker, stood with its head high, already sensing the tension in the air. Today, she said, her voice clear and steady in the pre-dawn chill. The horse learns its place. It was not a suggestion. It was the first move in her 3-day campaign. She was demonstrating her worth, starting with the most difficult, stubborn problem on his ranch. They worked in the enclosed space of the round pen, the rising sun casting their long shadows across the dust. Flicker was a bundle of raw, explosive energy, its fear manifesting as aggression. It kicked out at the fence, snorting, its muscles bunched like coiled springs. Boone's method had always been one of pressure and release, of slowly wearing the horse down until it accepted its fate. It was a battle of wills, and it often left both man and horse exhausted and resentful. Ka's way was different. She did not enter the pen with him at first. She stood outside, watching him, her eyes missing nothing. "You fight him like an enemy," she called out, her voice cutting through the horse's panicked snorts. "You see his fear, and you try to break it. You cannot break fear. You must give it a new shape." She unlatched the gate and stepped inside, the rope still coiled in her hand. She ignored Boone completely, her focus entirely on the animal. She began to walk the perimeter of the pen, her steps measured and calm, never taking her eyes off the horse. Flicker watched her, dancing sideways, ready to bolt or strike. She mirrored its movements, a predator's fluid grace. Yet her posture was non-threatening. "The rope is not a weapon," she said, her voice low now, meant as much for the horse as for him. "It is a conversation." She began to uncoil the rope, letting it play out behind her. She showed him how to hold it, not in a tight, controlling fist, but lightly, letting it slide through his fingers. You do not pull, you ask. For the next hour, she taught him a new language, a language of subtle shifts in weight, of the angle of his shoulders, of the energy he projected. She showed him how to use the rope not to force the horse's head, but to suggest a direction, to apply a pressure so slight that the horse felt it was its own idea to turn. He had worked with horses his entire life, but he felt like a clumsy child. His movements heavy and loud compared to her quiet, intense focus. He felt the sweat trickle down his temples, the burn in his shoulders from holding the rope, the frustration of unlearning a lifetime of habit. Finally, the moment came to introduce the saddle. This was always Flicker's breaking point. The sight of the heavy leather object sent it into a frenzy. As Boone approached with it, the horse's eyes rolled white, and it kicked out violently, its iron-shod hoof striking the wooden fence with a sound like a gunshot. Ka stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "No," she said. "You bring it like an attack. Let him accept your hand first." She walked toward the horse, empty-handed. She did not try to touch its head or neck. Instead, she knelt in the dust, making herself small, and began to breathe, a long, slow, audible rhythm. She held one hand out, palm down, and waited. Flicker watched her, its nostrils flared, its body trembling. It took a hesitant step, then another. It lowered its head, sniffing her outstretched hand, its warm breath ghosting across her skin. It did not flinch when her fingers finally made contact, resting gently on the solid muscle of its shoulder. She looked over at Boone. "Now," she whispered. He brought the saddle, moving with a slowness that felt unnatural. He held it out, letting the horse smell the leather. Then, with Ka's hand still resting on its shoulder, a silent anchor of calm, he slowly, carefully, settled the saddle onto Flicker's back. The horse tensed, a tremor running through its entire body. It was ready to explode, but Ka was there. She began to hum, a low, guttural sound, the same sound he had heard her use before. She leaned her forehead against the horse's neck, her breath and the vibration of her humming flowing directly into the terrified animal. Slowly, miraculously, the tension began to seep out of the horse. The rigid muscles softened. The trembling ceased. The horse stood, accepting the weight, accepting the human touch, conquered not by force, but by a will that was stronger and quieter than its own fear. Ka straightened up and looked at Boone. The sun was fully up now, and in its clear, bright light, her eyes were calm and luminous. The dust and sweat on her face could not diminish the fierce pride in her gaze. "I bring the ability to stand shoulder to shoulder," she said, her voice quiet but resonant. "I do not run from the fight. I teach you how to face it." Her message was delivered. Her test was complete. The midday meal was a silent battlefield of a different kind. When Boone came to the cabin, washing the dust and sweat from his face and hands at the basin on the porch, Ayana was waiting. She had not been idle. The air was filled with an aroma he didn't recognize, something wild and savory and deeply comforting. She had set the small table inside the cabin with 3 bowls of a thick, fragrant stew. He saw bits of potato and corn, but the rich, green color came from the wild leaves she had gathered, the ones he had always considered weeds. A stack of freshly made flatbread, still warm, sat in the center of the table. He sat, with Ka opposite him and Ayana at the head. The meal was a stark contrast to the morning's labor. The work with the horse had been about tension, control, and the fine edge between violence and submission. This was about warmth, nourishment, and a quiet, deliberate offering of peace. The stew was delicious, the flavors complex and satisfying. It was the taste of the land itself, but a part of the land he had never known. He ate slowly, and when he was done, he found he did not want to get up. The aroma, the quiet satisfaction of the food, the simple peace of the small cabinet held him in his chair. He was used to eating quickly, a functional refueling before returning to work. But this felt different. This felt like the end of a journey, not a pause in the middle of one. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft scrape of their spoons against the wooden bowls. He looked at Ayana. She was watching him, a small, knowing look in her eyes. She had not spoken a word, but her message was as clear as Ka's had been in the corral. This is what I bring. Not the fight, but the reason for it. A place you want to come home to. It was a home that wasn't a home yet, a family that wasn't a family. But for a few moments, sitting at that table, it felt more real than anything he had ever known. In the afternoon, the tension returned. Boone set about fixing the heavy stable door, which had a broken hinge. The work was hard, requiring him to lift the heavy door while trying to align the rusted iron pieces. As he worked, sweating in the afternoon sun, the sisters came out and sat on the cabin steps. They did not speak to each other. They did not speak to him. They simply sat, their skirts pooled around them on the weathered wood, and watched. Their shared presence was an immense, unspoken weight. They were 2 distinct halves of a single question. He could feel their eyes on him. Ka's analytical gaze assessing his strength and skill. Ayana's softer gaze taking in his frustration and effort. He looked at them, sitting there against the backdrop of the home they had made their own, and a devastating realization settled over him. For the past weeks, the homestead had felt full. It was filled with 2 different rhythms. Ka's was the rhythm of the barn, of work, of a silent, shared competence. Ayana's was the rhythm of the cabin, of the garden, of a quiet, nurturing peace. The place felt alive with their opposing and complementary energies. To choose one meant to deliberately, irrevocably, extinguish the other. If he chose Ka, he would lose the scent of wild herbs from the cabin, the quiet meals, the gentle presence that soothed the rough edges of his world. If he chose Ayana, he would lose the silent partner in the barn, the second pair of skilled hands, the fierce, steady presence that made him feel less alone in the face of hardship. Choosing was not an act of gaining a wife. It was an act of losing a vital part of the new life that had taken root here. He wasn't just choosing a person. He was choosing to amputate a piece of his own world. The sun finally set, offering no relief. Night came, and with it, the wind. It howled down from the mountains, a lonely, mournful sound. Boone lay in the loft, staring into the darkness, listening to the wind tear at the roof. It sounded like a saw, relentlessly cutting through the thick wooden beams of the barn, just as the choice was sawing through his soul. He thought of Ka's strength, of Ayana's peace. He thought of Flicker, standing calm in its stall for the first time. He thought of the taste of the stew. He did not sleep. The first day was over, and he was no closer to an answer, only deeper in the heart of the impossible question. The second day was a day of judgment. It arrived not on horseback, but in a rickety wagon pulled by a sway-backed mule. its left rear wheel wobbling with a painful, rhythmic squeak that announced its approach long before it came into view. Boone was splitting logs by the side of the barn when he heard it, the sound of the outside world grinding its way into his isolated refuge. He set the axe down and watched the wagon limp into the yard. It was Martha Miller, the widow Fletcher Knox had spoken of. Her face was a mask of weary resolve. Her hands, gnarled from work and worry, held the reins with a desperate grip. She stopped the mule and looked at Boone, her expression one of helpless frustration. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice thin and frayed. "The wheel. The bolt's sheared clean off. I don't know what I'd have done if it gave out another mile back." "Let me take a look," Boone said, walking over. As he knelt to inspect the damaged wheel, he was acutely aware of the cabin door opening. Ayanna appeared first, her face etched with a quiet concern. A moment later, Ka emerged, her presence a silent, solid counterpoint. They stood on the porch, watching. Martha's eyes darted from Boone's back to the two women. The weariness in her face hardened into something else, suspicion. Her gaze was sharp, a physical thing that prodded and measured. Short sentences formed in Boone's mind, a reflection of her clipped, judgmental stare. A woman alone, two Apache women, a man in the middle. The math was simple. The conclusion, ugly. "I heard you had company," Martha said, her voice tight. She did not look at Boone, but at the sisters. Her eyes swept over them, taking in their worn but clean dresses, their dark braids, their still, watchful posture. It was not a glance of curiosity. It was an inventory of a threat. "They needed help," Boone said, his voice flat as he examined the broken axle. "Seems to be a lot of that going around," Martha replied, a bitter edge to her words. "Folks needing help, and folks who've had things taken from them." The accusation was not spoken, but it filled the yard, as thick and choking as dust. Ayanna took a half step back, as if to retreat into the shadows of the doorway, her sensitive nature recoiling from the woman's open hostility. But Ka did not move. She stepped forward, to the very edge of the porch, and stood in the full, unforgiving light of the morning sun. Her back was straight, her chin was high. She did not cross her arms in a defensive posture. She let them hang loose at her sides. She met Martha Miller's hostile gaze and held it, her own expression unreadable, impassive. She simply stood there and absorbed the woman's fear, her suspicion, her hatred. She soaked it all in without flinching, without a word. Boone felt the meaning of her stance in his bones. She was not just defying the widow. She was showing him, "Look, this is the price. This is the world that awaits you if you choose me. Every trip to town, every neighbor who passes, every time trouble strikes anywhere in this territory, their eyes will turn to us, to me, and by extension, to you. This will be your life." He worked in silence, wrestling the broken wheel from the wagon. He found a spare bolt in his workshop, heated it in the forge, and hammered it into shape. The clang of his hammer on the anvil was the only sound, a hard, angry rhythm against the heavy silence. Martha stood by her mule, pretending to check its harness, but her eyes never strayed far from the two women on the porch. An hour passed. When the work was done, the wheel was solid. "I'm obliged, Mr. Carter," Martha said, her voice still holding a chill. She climbed back onto the wagon seat, her movements stiff. She did not thank the sisters. She did not acknowledge their existence again. She just clucked to her mule and drove away, leaving the yard feeling tainted, violated. Boone watched her go, the dust settling in her wake. He turned. Ayanna had already retreated inside, but Ka remained on the porch, watching him. He walked over, wiping the grease and sweat from his hands on a rag. He stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up at her. She came down one step, her eyes searching his face, trying to gauge the effect of the widow's visit. Her expression was stark, stripped of all artifice. "If you choose me," she said, her voice low and certain, Your life will be harder. Their talk will follow you. Their suspicion will be a shadow on this house. You will never know a day of easy peace with your neighbors again." As she spoke, she reached out and pressed her fingers, just for a second, against the center of his chest, over his heart. The touch was not soft or romantic. It was firm, brief, a brand of hard truth. It was a gesture that said, "Feel this. This is the weight. Are you strong enough to carry it then?" Just as quickly. She withdrew her hand, turned, and walked into the cabin, leaving him alone with the echo of her touch and the undeniable truth of her words. The afternoon was hot and still, the world drowsing under the weight of the sun. Boone was sitting in the shade of the barn, trying to whittle a new handle for a tool, but his hands were unsteady, his mind replaying the morning's events. He heard a soft footfall and looked up to see Ayanna. She stood before him, a small canteen in her hand. "The spring at the bottom of the north pasture," she said, her voice quiet. "The water runs slow. I think the stones have blocked it. Will you come with me?" It was a simple request, a practical task, but he knew it was more than that. He nodded, rose, and they walked together, leaving the tense confines of the homestead behind. They walked in silence for a time, following the faint cattle trail that wound through the dry, yellow grass and the skeletal remains of last season's sunflowers. The land was quiet, resting. He could feel the tension in his own shoulders begin to ease, the knot in his stomach loosening its grip. They reached the small, shaded hollow where a seep of water emerged from a fissure in the rock, feeding a shallow, muddy pool before disappearing back into the thirsty earth. It was as she'd said. A small landslide of pebbles and dirt had dammed the flow to a mere trickle. They knelt side by side, their shoulders almost touching, and began to clear the blockage with their hands. The water was cool against their skin, the dark mud soft and yielding. They worked without speaking, the only sounds the clatter of displaced stones and the gentle gurgle of the water as it began to run free. When they were done, they sat on a large, flat rock, their hands still damp and muddy. Ayanna stared into the now clear pool of water, watching her own reflection ripple and reform. "When we were running," she began, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear it. "Before the riverbed, there was a time, 3 days with no water. The men who chased us were gone, but the sun had taken their place. Ka would not let me stop. She would pull me to my feet and make me walk until I fell again." Her voice was a monotone, a simple recitation of facts. She paused, taking a slow breath. "On the last day, I told her I would not walk anymore. I told her to go on. I laid down in the shade of a rock and I closed my eyes. I was not afraid. I was tired. I was ready to let the sun take me. I had forgotten the reason to draw the next breath. It was a kind of peace." Boone listened, his heart aching with the image of her giving up, of her spirit being bleached out by the relentless sun. She looked up from the water and met his eyes. Her own were clear, and they held a truth so profound and unadorned that it stole his breath. "You made me want to live again," she said. The words were not a plea. They were not a demand or a bargain. It was a statement of fact, a gift. It was the purest, most honest thing anyone had ever said to him. She was telling him what her presence meant, not what it would cost him, but what he had already given her. In that moment, she was not the fragile woman who retreated from a neighbor's harsh words. She was a person who had walked to the very edge of her own existence and had chosen to turn back. Her strength was not in her fists or in her defiance, but in her will to embrace a life she had been ready to discard. He didn't know what to say. The language of his life of fences and livestock and the price of grain had no words for this. So he did the only thing he could. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, small and warm, a surprising strength in their grip. They sat there, holding hands, not as lovers making a promise, but as two people acknowledging a deep and immutable truth in the silence. It was not a pledge for the future. It was a recognition of the present. On the long walk back to the ranch, the world seemed different. The colors of the landscape were sharper, the air cleaner. He could feel the warmth of her hand long after they had let go, and as they walked, the final, stubborn piece of the puzzle of his own heart clicked into place. He looked at her, walking beside him, her head held high, and he finally understood the true nature of his hesitation. He thought of Ka's challenge, of the hard, combative life she offered. It was a life he understood. It was a life of struggle, which he had always known. He was not afraid of that hardship. He was afraid of this. He was afraid of the quiet peace he felt at Ayana's side. He was afraid of the hope she represented, a hope so bright and fragile that the thought of it being extinguished was a pain he could not bear. Ka offered a life of fighting side by side. Ayana offered a life worth fighting for. And it was the second that terrified him, because it was so much more precious, and so much easier to lose. It was not that he didn't want to choose. It was that he was afraid to. He looked up at the sky. A change was coming. The endless, empty blue of the past few days was gone. To the west, a bank of dark, heavy clouds was building, piling up on the horizon like a bruise. The air was growing thick, humid, and still. A storm was coming. The decision was no longer a distant point on the horizon. It was here, now, gathering its strength, ready to break. The world was a held breath. The third day arrived not with a sunrise, but a slow leaking of gray light into a sky the color of slate. The air was thick, heavy, and motionless. The storm that had gathered on the horizon was now directly overhead, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on the small ranch, silencing the birds and insects. Every leaf on the cottonwood tree was still waiting. Boone came out of the barn and stopped. The choice was no longer a decision to be made. It was a truth to be spoken. The last 2 days had been a crucible, stripping away everything but the essential. He knew the answer. He had known it. He realized, as he walked back from the spring with Ayana's hand in his. He had only been wrestling with the fear of admitting it. She was already there, as if she had known he was coming. Ka sat alone on the top step of the porch, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. She was looking out at the bruised, swollen sky, not at him. As he walked closer, he saw the faint, dark smudges beneath her eyes, the slight redness that even her iron will could not completely erase. She had not slept either. He stopped a few feet from the steps, the silence between them a living thing. He opened his mouth to speak, to begin the impossible. But she spoke first, her voice cutting through the heavy air. She did not turn to look at him. "I have seen it," she said. Her voice was not bitter or angry. It was calm, level, the sound of a stone settling at the bottom of a deep well. It was the voice of a person who has faced an undeniable fact and has chosen to name it. "I have watched you. I have tried to show you my worth, my hands, my strength, how I can stand with you. It is a good argument, but it is an argument for the head." She finally turned, and her eyes met his. The fire in them was gone, banked and cooled into a hard, clear gaze that saw everything. "His heart is in another place," she said, as if finishing a thought she was having with herself. It was not an accusation. It was a conclusion, a verdict she had reached on her own. She had made her case and had seen, with the clear eyes of a warrior, that the territory was already lost. The cabin door opened softly. Ayana stepped out, her movements hesitant. She was not there to claim a victory. Her eyes were wide, filled with a sorrow that was as deep for her sister as it was for the moment itself. She looked from Ka's rigid posture to Boone's tormented face. She was not asking who he had chosen. She was asking him to be honest, to make the end clean, to honor the truth, whatever it was. Boone's gaze shifted from Kay's knowing eyes to Ayana's pleading ones, and he finally spoke. The words came out rough, torn from a place deep inside him. "I was afraid," he said, the confession a weight lifting from his soul. He looked at Ka. You offered me a life I understand. A fight, a struggle, side by side. I know how to fight. It's all I've ever known. I was not afraid of the hardship you showed me. Then, his eyes found Ayanna. I was afraid of the peace you showed me, he admitted, his voice cracking on the last word. You made me feel a quiet I had forgotten was real. You made me want a life, not just endure one. And that was terrifying. To want something that much, it means you can lose it. It is easier to stand in a storm than it is to pray the storm doesn't come. He was laying himself bare. He was confessing his cowardice, his deepest fear. The fear of loss was greater than the fear of a physical fight. The fear of a broken heart was greater than the fear of a broken bone. Ayanna took a hesitant step toward him, her hand rising as if to touch him, then falling back to her side. There were no words left. The truth was out, naked and trembling in the oppressive gray light. He moved. It was not a decision, but an instinct, a magnetic pull he had been fighting for days. He closed the distance between himself and Ayanna in 2 strides. He raised his arms, and she stepped into them, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as if it were a place she had known her entire life. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and the feeling was not one of victory or passion. It was a feeling of profound, earth-shattering rightness. It was the feeling of a lock finding its key. It was a homecoming. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of wild herbs and wood smoke. And for the first time in his life, Boone Carter felt the rigid, solitary armor he had built around his heart simply dissolve. It was a perfect, crystalline moment of peace. And in that same moment, he felt the price. Over Ayanna's shoulder, he saw Ka. She was still sitting on the step, but she was no longer looking at them. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, but she had seen the embrace. She had felt its finality. The joy that flooded through him was instantly matched by a sharp, cutting blade of pain for the woman he was not holding. Every choice has another name. This choice was named Ka. He held Ayanna tighter, a desperate, futile attempt to protect the moment from the sorrow that surrounded it. Ka rose to her feet. She did not slump. She did not falter. She stood tall, her back a straight, unbending line. She pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, a small, final gesture of gathering herself. She did not look at them again. She turned, with the quiet dignity of a person who knows how to lose without breaking, and walked toward the barn. Her silhouette was a stark, lonely shape against the darkening sky. A single fat drop of rain struck the dust at Boone's feet, creating a dark, spreading star. Another hit his shoulder. Then the sky opened. It was not a gentle shower. It was a deluge, a sudden, violent release of the sky's long-held tension. The rain came down in hard, driving sheets, instantly turning the dust of the yard into dark, running mud. The sound was a roar, a deafening percussion on the tin roof of the barn and the wooden shingles of the cabin. It was a sound that consumed the world, washing away everything else. Boone and Ayanna stood locked in their embrace, the rain soaking their hair, their clothes, plastering them to their skin. But they didn't move. The cold shock of the water was a baptism. Ayanna was trembling, not from cold, but from the force of the emotions that were shaking her. He could feel her quiet sobs against his chest, their sound lost in the roar of the downpour. The rain was a curtain, a shield. It fell between them and the barn where Ka had gone. It hid them from the world. It hid their tears. It was a wild, elemental grief and a wild, elemental joy, all happening at once under the cover of the storm. The smell of the rain hitting the parched earth rose up around them, the scent of petrichor, of dust and life and release. 3 hearts, which had been bound together in a delicate, impossible triangle, were being reshaped by the storm. 1 was breaking, 2 were fusing, and the rain fell on them all, a fierce, impartial, and cleansing grace. The rain stopped just before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The sky was a pale, tender blue, scrubbed of all its anger. In the quiet that followed the storm, the unspoken sentence passed upon Ka had to be carried out. The fourth day was here. It was noon when they came. Fletcher Knox and two other ranchers Boone knew by sight, their horses picking their way carefully through the mud of the yard. They didn't have the look of a posse, but of a jury, sent to confirm that order had been restored. Boone met them in the center of the yard, the same ground where every battle, spoken and unspoken, had been fought. Ayanna stood on the porch, a silent pillar of support. From the barn, Ka watched, unseen, from the shadows. Boone's posture was different now. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. "Fletcher," Boone said, his voice even. "Carter," Fletcher replied, his eyes taking in the scene. He looked at Ayanna on the porch, then glanced toward the barn, looking for the second woman. "We came to see how you've handled your trouble." "It's handled," Boone said. "One stays, one leaves at sunrise. My choice is made. My affairs are in order." He said it with a finality that left no room for argument. But Fletcher was not there to argue the choice. He was there to impose the terms of its acceptance. "That's not enough." One of the other men, a rancher named Cobb, spoke up. "It ain't right. You can't just keep an Apache woman here like she was a stray cow you'd found. It's not decent. It invites the wrong kind of talk, the wrong kind of trouble." "What's right in your eyes?" Cobb Boone asked, his voice dangerously quiet. It was Fletcher who answered, his voice the sound of unbending community law. "There's a preacher making the circuit. He'll be in Dusty Gulch in 5 days' time. If she's staying, you'll marry her. You'll stand up in front of God and everyone, and you'll make it a proper thing. You'll give her your name. That's the price for peace. That's our guarantee. A marriage, a public ceremony to transform an anomaly into a form they could understand and, eventually, ignore. It wasn't a request. It was the condition for his and Ayanna's survival in this place." Boone looked at Ayanna. Her face was pale, but she met his gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He turned back to Fletcher. 5 days. Boone said, "We'll be there." Fletcher held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded, satisfied. The jury had delivered its terms. Without another word, they turned their horses and rode away. The 4 days that followed were the strangest of Boone's life. They were a period of intense, focused instruction, a quiet, almost sacred passing of knowledge. The house became a classroom, the yard a training ground. Ka, the unsmiling, patient teacher. Ayanna, the diligent, heartbroken student. The shadow of Ka's departure and the impending wedding hung over everything. But the work itself was a shield against the pain. Ka taught Ayanna not the things of the heart, but the things of the hands. She showed her how to read the clouds piling over the mountains, to know the difference between a wind that carried rain and one that only carried dust. She walked her through the pasture, pointing out the herbs that would soothe a fever, the roots that could be poulticed on a wound, the bitter leaves that would settle a sour stomach. They worked together in the smokehouse, Ka teaching Ayanna how to properly salt and cure the meat from a rabbit Boone had brought in, her hands moving with a swift, economic grace. Ayanna's following more slowly, learning the rhythm. She was teaching her sister how to survive in this new world. More than that, she was teaching her how to keep Boone alive. It was her final, selfless gift, a dowry of brutal, practical love. Boone stayed out of their way, watching from a distance, his heart a painful mix of gratitude and grief. He was witnessing a quiet, profound act of love, and he knew he was the cause of its necessity. On the evening of the 4th day, as dusk settled, he found Ka by the corral, checking the cinch on the saddle she would use in the morning. He walked up to her, a small, heavy leather pouch in his hand. He started, but the words wouldn't come. Thank you felt insultingly small. "I'm sorry" felt like a betrayal of the choice he had made. He held out the pouch. "It's not much, but it'll help you get a start. Wherever you're going." She looked at the pouch, then at his face. She did not take it. Instead, she stepped forward. She put her arms around him, a gesture so unexpected it shocked him into stillness. It was not a soft embrace. It was hard, brief, the hug of a soldier, a comrade. Her arms were strong around his back, her head pressed against his chest for a single heartbeat. Then she stepped back, and her eyes were clear. "She knows how to heal a wound," Ka said, her voice a low command. "She knows how to find food where others see only dirt. But she does not have a shield for her heart. It has always been my job to be her shield." She looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time, he saw not a warrior, but an older sister entrusting him with her most precious treasure. "That is your job now," she said. "Be gentle with her heart. Boone Carter, it is a better thing than you deserve." She turned and walked into the barn to spend her last night, leaving him standing alone in the fading light. At dawn, she was ready. She had packed the jerky she and Ayanna had prepared, and 2 full canteens of water. Dusty, the most reliable horse, was saddled. Boone added the pouch of money to the saddlebag. He didn't know if she would take it, but he couldn't let her leave with nothing. He and Ayanna stood on the porch as Ka mounted the horse. She looked at them one last time. Her gaze rested on her sister. She did not smile, but a softness entered her eyes. "Be happy, little sister," she said in Apache. Then she turned to Boone. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was a farewell, a concession, and a final, silent challenge to be worthy of what he had won. She turned the horse and rode east, into the rising sun, never once looking back. They watched until she was just a speck, until the speck disappeared, and a part of the life of the homestead disappeared with her. Later that morning, they rode to the settlement. It was barely a town, just a dusty collection of buildings. The ceremony was held on the wooden porch of the general store. A handful of ranchers and their wives stood in the street, watching. Some faces were cold and hostile. Others were merely curious. A few, including Fletcher Knox, gave Boone a grudging nod of respect for keeping his word. The preacher was a thin, tired man with a stained coat and a Bible worn soft with use. His words were quick, recited from memory, devoid of warmth. Ayanna stood beside Boone, her hand in his. Her fingers were ice cold, and he could feel a fine tremor running through her. She was wearing her best dress, mended and clean, and her hair was neatly braided. But she looked small and terribly alone, facing the cold eyes of this new, alien world. They spoke the vows, their voices quiet but clear in the still air. "I do. I do." A ring was not expected. A kiss was not offered. The preacher closed his Bible. "I pronounce you man and wife," he said, and the contract was sealed. The ride home was silent. The land they rode through was the same, but the world had changed. Ayanna still trembled beside him. Boone reined in their horses under the shade of a lone cottonwood. He turned to her. "Ayanna," he said, his voice gentle. "Look at me." She slowly raised her eyes to his. They were filled with fear and uncertainty. "I didn't choose this because it was easy," he said, his voice raw with a conviction that came from the very center of his soul. "I chose this because it was for tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, I chose you." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, but for the first time that day, the terror in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a fragile, flickering light. That night, they sat on the porch steps, the air cool and clean after the rain. The moon was a bright sliver in a sky littered with stars. The familiar sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets, the sigh of the wind through the eaves were the same, but different. The yard felt vast, empty. It was missing a step, a presence. Ka's shadow was gone, and the space she'd left was a tangible ache. But there was a new sound, a new rhythm. It was the soft sound of their breathing, a quiet harmony in the vast silence. It was the sound of a shared world, no longer a triangle, but a single, straight line pointing toward the future. Ayana leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. They did not speak. They just sat and listened to the night, to the quiet beginning of their life. Tomorrow, the sun would rise. They would get up. He would check the fences, and she would tend her garden. They would go to the barn, and the ghost of a proud, strong woman would be there. But they would be there together. They would build their new life, not with grand words or easy promises, but with their own two hands, with the quiet courage it takes to protect a choice that has already been paid for. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with us. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and like this video. And if you'd like to support us further, hitting that hype button helps this story reach more listeners just like you.